Welcome to this latest edition of the Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. My name is Mark Titterington. I'm a co-founder of the Forum and also a member of the Advisory Council. And today, guest presenting our latest podcast. Today, talking with Michael Werz, the Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Michael, just absolutely fantastic to have you with us. I really enjoyed our discussion at the Forum's annual conference last month. I just want to pick up, if we can do, on some of the things that we talked about during that discussion, and maybe start by talking about this, defining this era that we're in. You described this current moment as wrecking ball politics when we talked, where existing international rules have been systematically dismantled. And I just wonder, in such a volatile environment, how can the food system serve as a stabilizing anchor rather than just another casualty of the chaos that we see?
Thank you, Mark. It's a great pleasure to see you again, and congratulations again to a successful event in Brussels. It was a pleasure to have a chance to talk to you guys. Look, I think we are living an era of tectonic change, and institutions that are rapidly deconsolidating, that are falling apart or are severely damaged in the process. At the same time, I think when I speak about the wrecking ball politics at the global level, there's a paradox in there with regard to the food systems that you and I care so much about, because I feel that it makes food systems more and not less important, because the crisis that we're seeing right now is at the same time establishing the foundation for a very basic conversation about how to establish a new global order that people can live in a more stable and a more equitable manner. And food is one of the domain where geopolitics can really decouple from human needs, because people need to eat regardless of who's in power, regardless of trade wars, and regardless of kind of ideological orientations. And I feel that that terrible reality in which close to 800 million people are suffering hunger right now globally is at the same time a source of leverage that we have in order to push these important conversations forwards. And I feel that there are possibilities to anchor food security and agri-food systems and the resilience of those as anchors for a new conversation about multilateralism that needs to consist of several parts. But at least we have an opportunity right now, especially with the Iran war and its cascading effects on food and fertilizer systems being an unfortunate exhibit of the interconnectedness of the world, that we have an opportunity to make a political point here.
Now, let's just pick up on a bit more of that, Michael. I mean, you're joining us obviously from Washington, D.C. today, and I don't just want to anchor this around the transatlantic discussion in terms of those multilateral partnerships. You've talked about that existential crisis in other forums in the transatlantic partnerships. Given what you said, what coalitions of the willing should we be forming right now? Do you think it's possible to form right now where the interest is there to protect the food supply from becoming a geopolitical bargaining chip? Let's put it like that.
That's a very good question, and it is difficult to answer. As you said, the transatlantic partnership was built on a shared assumption that the United States was, some would say, a limited liability anchor of an institutionalized world. We in Washington like to talk about the United States as the anchor of the rules-based order. People in Iraq, people in Vietnam, people in Nicaragua would probably have a slightly different take on this, but be that as it may, that transatlantic partnership, with historical changes, but also the political accelerant of the current administration in Washington, I feel is a historical artifact. And then the question is, as you say, what new actors can establish a modus vivendi, new institutions that are able to carry that weight that the multilateral system since the late 1940s has been carrying. And I feel with regard to agricultural and trade issues, it is important to look at new potential partners as not as marginal players, but as key anchors in an agri-food system. And obviously, there are a number of Western countries that are come to mind here, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, important parts of Latin America and Africa, because I also very strongly feel we cannot sacrifice the normative, legal, and democratic foundations of the global system just because we feel that right now everybody that is willing to invest and every global player that is playing an important role can bend or shape the rules. So I feel this is an enormous challenge. This is very complicated, but I would argue that you think about agricultural and food system as integral parts of fairly well-established climate agreements, of multilateral agreements that do not depend on the broken WTO system, and you move forward with a conversation of a coalition of the willing that A, have a stake at play, that B, define national interest beyond the immediate egotistic notion of just serving my country, but also have a notion of the global good that is at play, and that also understand that rules and norms are important.
I just want to press a little bit further on that, if I may, Michael, with a follow-up question. I mean, we talk about the world that emerged in the 1940s was very much driven by a compulsion to avoid the tragedies of the first half of the 20th century, and indeed, in some cases, what gone before that. What's the compulsion now to form something new? Where does that drive, that energy come from, do you think? Or do you think we've got to work with the situation that we've got and convince as many people as we can by argument and persuasion?
No, I mean, it's a mixture of that. Obviously, after the Second World War, when the United States nations were established in San Francisco, basically looking at the new Pacific arena that was a discovery for the United States at the time in terms of its geographical importance, that was a very different environment because the horrors of the war with 50 million victims, the extermination of the European Jews in Nazi concentration camps was still a fresh memory. At the same time, I feel that in the current world where access to information is so much easier, we can make an argument that people that think that in a world which is divided, where you have for example, a food system in the global north, simplistically speaking, that works pretty well, and one in the global south that doesn't work, that in the medium term, you will be living in a stable world and an economically productive world. That notion is an illusion. And so I feel that there's an urgency of the now in current conversations, because with the converging effects of agri-food systems under strain, a lot of people being hungry, food being systematically weaponized, for example, in Ukraine or in South Sudan or in Gaza, and at the same time, an ever increasing linear pressure because of climate change on those systems. I mean, anyone that is not willing to understand that we are heading not into a good direction if we do not act decisively is just living in a different world than I live in.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about the weaponization of food, and that certainly resonated with a lot of people at our annual conference last month. I mean, I suppose my question is a follow-on from that. How does the system get prepared? What are the early warning indicators that Europe or indeed other global agri-food actors are going to need to monitor to anticipate disruptions before they escalate? I often argue here in Brussels and at the EU level that the challenges that we face today are because we didn't anticipate enough over the last 5 to 10 years. So how do we get better at that, Michael?
Yeah, that is a key question. And I think there is a lot to do for organization like yours, because as you mentioned, I work a lot on the weaponization of food. And we have seen in Ukraine, where food was used as a long-range weapon by the Russian military with the systematic attacks on food infrastructure, in the Sahel, but food is often used as a recruitment or retention tool for insurgent groups. And then obviously in Gaza, where food scarcity was used to starve Palestinians, we see very concerning and often illegal ways of weaponizing food. And the question is, how do you anticipate the weaponization of food? Because it obviously rarely announces itself if it's part of an integrated military or insurgency strategy. It often happens gradually. So early warning indicators need to be structural and not just reactive. And that is very important for private sector companies, but also governors, that they engage much more systematically in foresight exercises, war games, better policy planning units that can anticipate these crises. And there are, I think, also on the policy side, a few immediate, very practical steps. I think we need to look at for example, export restriction announcements, which are often a leading indicator for broader stress on the system. Fertilizer concentration is a huge issue because we are often only, as we see in Iran, only one political decision away from a crisis. We need much more systematically to look at port and logistic choke points, the Black Sea being exhibit one during the Ukraine war. And we need to monitor shipping routes and stress on insurance markets. Because they price risk in before usually governments are often willing to acknowledge this. And currency volatility in food importing nations are an important indicator. And so is the political rhetoric. If governments, like, for example, the Chinese, describe food as a matter of national sovereignty and national security, you are very, very quickly moving into a situation where you're laying the political groundwork for the restrictions. And all of this has to come together. I think we need clearinghouses and more engagement in these areas. It's also politically and intellectually interesting, as scary as it is right now.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I risk exploding our time together, Michael. But you use that phrase "weaponization of food," but the elements that sit behind it, they've been with us for some time, and we haven't reacted to those indicators. I mean, we can go back to the beginning of the century when we started to see these choke points emerge, export restrictions there. I suppose my question is, what gives you confidence that we might now begin to act when we haven't for the best part of a quarter of a century?
Because we are seeing with the Iran war, which in a way is the first real war of the 21st century in a modern era where you have cascading effects that are very likely to produce more harm and more victims in regions thousands of kilometers or miles away from the battlefield in Iraq, than the kinetic attacks on Iran, than the kinetic attacks on Iran themselves, as terrible as they might be for the population in the country. And so the fact that our supply chains, our trade routes, the way we produce important commodities, but also fertilizers, are so highly integrated, and many of these supply chains are razor thin because of the interest of making them economically as profitable as possible. We need to reconceptualize global trade, the geoeconomic dependencies, but also needed deterrence against the weaponization of food as a key question of resilience. And that doesn't mean hugging trees and just kind of talking about climate change nilly-willy. These are hard national and geoeconomic interests of developed and emerging nations that need to be reframed. And I feel that we have an opportunity here, but also an obligation, because the foreseeable future, if you play out these current developments another 20, 25, or 30 years, the outcome is not going to be feasible, manageable, or sustainable. So there is an urgency of moving forward now. That this is a difficult challenge, I have no illusions about, but I don't see any alternative.
I think it's a clear call to action, Michael. And as I said, I think that's what engaged many of our folks at the annual conference last month, as I said. Can we just talk about Global South for a second? As you say, often we look at this from a Global North perspective, where the urgency to act maybe perhaps isn't always as apparent as you said. When you look at the transition that we need, there's an argument to say that it can't succeed, it won't succeed, it shouldn't succeed without meaningful leadership from the global south. When you look at it in that context, what does constructive leadership look like for you from emerging producer and consumer nations, and what are the incentives that can support it?
Yeah, again, a complicated question, but I think we are starting a conversation that goes into the right direction, because it is clear that the traditional tendency to frame food security issues and global South engagement in terms of development and humanitarian aid, they are strategically wrong, and they need to be part of the past. If you look at key countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, maybe even Ethiopia, they are central actors in the food security environment, whose political decisions will determine whether we're going to be transitioning into the right direction or not. And that means that these processes need to be driven by a constructive leadership, especially from African nations. They need to drive the agenda on anything from soil health to smallholder productivity to kind of how to structure technology transfers from more developed countries. At the same time, again, I would insist that it is very important not to sacrifice normative foundations of accountability, democratic procedures, and transparency, which obviously in some of the African countries is a real issue, and one should not have any illusions about that. But at the same time, it is interesting to see that countries like Brazil, for example, are starting to use their extraordinary agricultural productivity as diplomatic capital to shape trade rules, for example, rather than simply reacting to them. Or that India, who's the largest food producer in many categories worldwide, is interested and pushing to have a seat at the table on global reserve architecture when it comes to commodities. So these are interesting attempts of these countries to establish themselves. They come with a responsibility to help establish institutional procedures that are transparent and democratic, but at the same time, those developments should be incentivized and supported, because if they happen under the guiding principles of transparency and accountability, it is a win-win situation for everybody involved.
I think it's so clear what you say, and again, as you've clearly articulated, global South has to be part of these discussions. I think we need to change the paradigm and the mindset, as you've alluded to, in terms of the way that we engage that. I know we're coming to the end of our time, Michael. We could spend a good hour and more together. Maybe just to draw you back to how you concluded at the conference, our annual conference last month here in Brussels. You talked about not just being bystanders to bulldozer politics. That certainly resonated with me, I think, particularly in the current environment. If you're a farmer or a food business leader or just a citizen listening to this podcast, you could be overwhelmed by the complexity of what we've been talking. I mean, these are really difficult challenges, but if you had one message, what would be the most courageous action that some of those folks could take today to help reboot the system from the bottom up?
Again, I think I go back to what I said at the beginning. We need a substantial investment in strategic foresight exercises, but also, especially the private sector, cannot and should not shy away from getting engaged in policy processes and in multilateral reform, because it won't happen if we don't concentrate all the forces. And let me just give you a few points here where action is needed. Very obviously, a lot discussed, nothing ever happened. Agricultural subsidies, $600 billion a year. The EU and the United States are artificially decreasing commodity costs. They're dumping surplus production, especially into Africa and Latin American countries. Absolutely damaging. This needs to be discussed. And you're in Brussels. Have fun with this. I know how politically complex this might be, but these discussions need to be had. I also think there is a lot of issues that are not easy to solve and rather unpleasant. I would say land purchases and leases by foreign countries in Africa, especially in Zambia, Ethiopia, Mozambique, some other countries, China, the Arab countries among them, very active in this field. displacing smallholder farmers, they're extracting food resources that should feed local populations. This is something that needs to be on the political agenda, but also needs to be a concern for the business community that is interested in a stable global agri-food system in the future. Same is true for market concentration. The trading companies that trade commodities is basically a handful globally, some of them privately owned and not as transparent as publicly established companies, but also control over global seed and agrochemical supply chains. Real big issue that needs to be discussed. It is controversial because there are massive national security, political, and business interests involved, but at the same time, that is important. And I would say the last point, and maybe the most important, the multilateral system is not very efficient. It's not great. It's difficult to defend it in its current form, but it's the only thing we have. And getting engaged in redefining and also broadening of what the multilateral system needs to be in the future, and trying to establish a thoughtful conversation about to which degree this means that national interests, especially of the larger nations, need to be adapted, adjusted, and also kind of limited to a certain degree for the greater global good, and investing in these multilateral engagements and frameworks. That is really important for the future to have steps forwards and make sure that we will be in a better world now in 10 years than we are right now.
Michael, it's just been fantastic to talk to you again. I know last month when you were with us, I rather glibly attempted to ask you to simplify whether or not you were feeling optimistic or cautious. I'm not going to ask you to do the same here today, but what I would say is, for me, I feel optimistic that people like you are putting these serious questions on the table and asking us to think about things in a different way, perhaps, than what we have in the past. And I know that that was appreciated by the conference audience last month, and no doubt anyone that listens to you and hopefully to this podcast. So thanks so much again for taking time to be with us, Michael. I always enjoy our time together. It's hugely appreciated.
Mark, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And also the work that you do in Brussels is very important, and I hope you continue as successfully as you have done in the past.
Thanks so much indeed, Michael. You've been watching or listening to another edition of the Food Systems Podcast, brought to you by the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. I'm Mark Titterington, and I've been your guest presenter for the last 20 to 25 minutes or so with Michael Werz. Join us again in Ireland for our regional conference at the beginning of next month to continue this and indeed other discussions on the future of the food systems. But for now, goodbye and good luck.